Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me here, the Monday edition of Point of View. What a weekend it has been. Of course, what a year it has been, if you think about this. Everything from a pandemic to now protests for the death of George Floyd and all of the rioting that has taken place as well, the defacing of monuments in Washington, D.C., the president having to go into a bunker, 50 different Secret Service agents hurt, as well as all sorts of other individuals across the nation as these very legitimate protests have turned into illegitimate riots, and so we'll get into that. Antifa is now deemed a terrorist organization, as well as lots of statements made by our political leaders in different states and even some of those in different cities that turned out to be inaccurate and not helpful. And so we'll get into all of that in the next couple of hours. But first of all, we wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking with a state representative here in the state of Texas. Jeff Leach has been on the program with us before and actually serves the citizens of House District 67, graduate of Southern Methodist University's Law School, before that a graduate of Baylor, and joins us now by phone. Representative Jeff Leach, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, great to be with you. How are you today?
I am good, but I'd love to get your comments before we get into some of the issues that relate maybe to the Texas legislature. But your thoughts about the protest, the riots, and just the incredible number of things that have transpired, even in the state of Texas, and even at the state capitol there in Austin, Texas.
Well, I think you said it right. What a weekend, and what a start to 2020. If you're reading the newspaper and watching the news over the weekend, you can't help but be saddened and dismayed and maybe a bit fearful. I do think it's important for people of faith like us, whether we're a policymaker, whatever line of work we may be in, to pray through this, to trust the Lord, to rely on His word, to have faith. This is not surprising to our God. It might be to us, but He's got this, and so I think it's important for us to claim Scripture and to be prayerful. And so what I've tried to do over the weekend is, just as I've been wrestling with this like every other American, is seek first to understand, and then second to be understood, to be quick to listen and slow to speak. And I think it's so important, while we're looking for our policymakers, Kerby, to make statements and to give answers, it's important for people of faith in the church to really step forward and provide the ultimate answers. And I believe if we do that, then the days of peace and confidence in this country are just ahead of us.
Yes. Well, let's, if we can, get into some of the issues. Originally, the idea was maybe to talk a little bit about the ideas related to the pandemic. So maybe we'll start there, because there have been questions that have said, what else can be done in Collin County? What about contact tracing and a number of other issues that are sort of on the table? So help us think through some of that, because I know that you've been in touch with the governor and there have been various ideas and proposals put forward. Can you give us some perspective on what's happening?
Well, Texas, to no one's surprise, has really led the way in among the 50 states in terms of being able to protect and look out for people's health and safety, to flatten the curve, so to speak, to slow the spread, to in an effort to protect the capacity, not only bed capacity, but ventilators and PPE of our hospitals, We've relied on data and doctors to do that, and the data, the facts do not lie. We're doing very well in Texas. Of course, we mourn the loss of life, and we take this pandemic, this sickness very seriously. But at the same time, we have to get back to work. We've got to open up the state. The health effects that are associated with joblessness, with folks being out of work, staying at home, kids being out of school, the effects of that are very long-lasting and substantial and serious as well. So from a policymaking perspective, Kerby, I mean, we could talk all day about this, but the short answer is our goal now is to continue to preserve, protect the health and safety of Texans, but to get this state up on our feet and back to work again so that we can lead the nation as we've done for the past 2 decades in economic growth. And I believe that we're well on our way to doing that, Kerby, in this state.
Let's talk about what you're going to face if indeed you are reelected in January, because up until now we've had a very robust Texas economy. One of the issues that people can find at jeffleach.com, which we have on our website there, is the whole issue of taxing and spending. Now, I think you are looking even more prescient by actually making it very difficult to enact a state income tax. So again, kudos to you in that regard, but it, I think, is going to suggest that it's going to be really difficult to figure out how to balance the budget, given the decreased revenues from everything from oil and gas to maybe even just so many Texans that have lost their jobs.
Well, Kerby, it is going to be difficult, but it's also simple. It's strangely simple as well. What the government needs to do at every level, federal, state, and local, is to take a cue from the people that were elected to serve. Every single family I know, every business owner I know over the past 2 months has had to make very difficult decisions in terms of saving money, not spending money frivolously, maybe unfortunately having to cancel that summer vacation and save money for the necessities of protecting your family and running your business. Government needs to do the same thing. Before we ever talk about additional revenue, which, by the way, I do not believe that a tax increase of any form or fashion should be on the table at any level. But we've got to look at our spending. I'm proud of the state leadership, totally support them asking for 5% across the board cuts in our state budget for our state agencies. I think we're probably going to have to do more than that. But make no mistake, we can continue to take care of this state. And it's important, the state income tax ban that we passed last fall, the essence of that was allowing people protecting their paychecks, allowing them, trusting them, I should say, to spend their own money as opposed to sending it to government and trusting government to spend it. I much more trust and respect the rights of people to spend and to save and to steward their own money than I do any government at any level.
Yes. Well, we need to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about one aspect of that, because a very significant portion, as you've pointed out on this program before, in terms of government spending in the state of Texas is on education. And, of course, if you go to your website, jeffleach.com, you'll see all sorts of comments. And it's amazing how many times, Jeff, I've seen you write about or speak to the issue of education. And I love how you say that so often, that you have 3 reasons to support public education: Brady, Charlotte, and Landry, which are your kids. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about that, because there are all sorts of questions about when do we start the schools? How safe will this be? What kind of spending indeed needs to take place if we have to cut back on our budgets? Of course, what about the spending on education, which is the lion's share of spending in the state of Texas? And so if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the aspects of what we are talking about today, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and you'll see this piece by certainly a link to Jeff Leach, and find out a little bit more about that. And as you go there, I might also mention my Viewpoints commentary today is about nursing homes and some of the issues that we certainly have talked about in terms of the pandemic. And then when we come back, we'll spend a little bit more time with him and then get back into, of course, all the issues in the news that have transpired. Just as a program note, let me mention that we'll have Lee Strobel with us in the next hours. We'll talk about apologetics a little bit. Jeff Myers the hour after that, as we talk a little bit about Summit Ministries. But in between, we'll continue to update you on so many issues in the news that you need to know about. We'll continue our conversation with Representative Jeff Leach right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of of the unnecessary tragedies of this pandemic has been the deaths of so many elderly patients in nursing homes, especially in New York. One Democratic assemblyman who represents Queens criticized the state because it failed to protect the lives of the most vulnerable members of our community. He went on to say the fact that we maintained and pushed COVID-positive patients into facilities that were not equipped to handle them, it was a fatal error. You know, as sad as that decision was, what is even more concerning is how and why that decision was made. There was a directive that was issued that a state official says, quote, was meant to protect those infected with the coronavirus from discrimination. Now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, in a recent article, explains what that official-sounding phrase about discrimination really meant. You know, it appears that New York wanted to create a new protected class. That would be a patient with COVID-19. Now, the guidance issued by the state seems to prohibit even testing a patient to see if he or she was still contagious. It proclaimed, quote, no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to the nursing home solely based on a confirmed or suspected diagnosis of COVID-19, unquote. So New York had more than 5,600 nursing home deaths. The governor and many other health officials admit that their policy was a deadly decision. But only recently have some begun to understand that this fatal decision was not based on the science. Apparently, it was based on a misguided attempt to implement a social justice ideal of non-discrimination against patients infected with the coronavirus, who then spread it to thousands of other patients. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Jeff Leach, representing the House District 67, Vice Chairman on the House Committee on Urban Affairs, as well as a member of the House Committee on Economic and Small Business Development, which I want to get to in just a minute. Graduate of Baylor University and SMU Law School. And Jeff, let's talk about education before we get into some of the small business issues, because education is the lion's share of spending in the state of Texas. You have certainly spoken out for the need for us to provide both property tax relief, but also funding for education, and really have tried to support Texas teachers. But where do we stand in this whole debate, especially as we face again a declining amount of revenue coming in from the state of Texas?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head in your emphasis on Texas teachers. I have tried over the years working with again, counterparts at every level of government, parents, students themselves, community leaders, to make sure that when we're spending money on classrooms or on education, I should say, that it's actually getting to the classrooms where it does the most good, supporting our teachers. Building schools, getting equipment, investing in technology, all of that, but really supporting our teachers. And if there's one thing, among many others, this pandemic has showed us, me and my family, as we've educated our kids as homeschool parents over the last 2 months, is how wonderful so many of our teachers are, even when they're not physically with the kids in our school. They have still invested and come alongside of us as parents to raise up, train up, and to educate our kids. Of course, that's our job, to train up the next generation of leaders, but we've got a lot of great teachers across the state that are doing that. So we did a number of great things last session to invest in education while also providing property tax relief and reform. And I believe very strongly, I'm very confident, supremely confident, if you will, that we can do that same thing next session, continue to invest in education. But there's no question that other areas of government are going to have to be scaled back to allow us to do so.
You know, one of the questions I was going to put to you, Mitch, maybe you have, but if not, perhaps when we have a chance to talk with the governor, is when do we think the schools might start again? Because the reason we closed them down was because of the pandemic, because we didn't know a whole lot. But we know a lot more now that those under the age of 18 have virtually no likelihood of dying of the coronavirus, only a little bit of likelihood of even catching it. And so I'm not trying to dismiss some of the concerns, but I am saying that we recognize that it may be a whole lot safer for the children than we knew, say, 2 or 3 months ago.
Well, yeah, there's no question. We're going to continue to do what we've done. Of course, sticking to committing ourselves to our principles, trusting people, but relying on data and doctors at the same time. I will tell you this: I don't have all the answers, but neither does the governor, neither does the president. If anyone tells you they do have all the answers, then I don't want to say they're lying, but they don't. And so I will say this, though. We are doing everything we possibly can to get our kids back to school in the fall, not only at our elementary schools, middle schools, at our private schools, parochial schools, high institutions of higher education, public and private, to get kids, students, and teachers back in school buildings. We're doing everything we can, working around the clock to be able to do that. And I'm confident that if things continue to trend in the direction that they're going, that will achieve that goal.
Let's begin talk about the fact that you do sit on a committee that looks at economic development, small business development. If I remember right, I think you were one of those individuals that wanted to try to cut the franchise tax. You wanted to do some things to stimulate business, and I think you know as well as anybody that if we're going to get the Texas economy back on track, a lot of that has to happen at the small business level, doesn't it?
The small businesses, the many small businesses across our community, state, across this country are the fuel, the engine behind our economy, especially here in Texas. We've got an incredible environment for small businesses to grow, to flourish, to thrive, for new startups to grow. We lead the nation in number one in women-owned, women startup businesses. I could rattle off a whole slew of economic just stats that show you Texas is really leading the way. There's a number of reasons for that. But small businesses should not be strapped with undue taxes. We should allow them. Yeah, sure, they've got to pay sales taxes. They got to pay property taxes. Problem with the franchise taxes, it's unduly burdensome. It was never intended to do what it's doing now. It's not actually performing like we originally thought it was when, even before I got into the legislature, they instituted the franchise tax. I believe that, especially coming out of a pandemic, we ought to look at, be courageous enough, follow our principles enough to look at cutting taxes, not raising them. And I'd love to start with the franchise tax, number one. And I believe a bunch of small business owners, by the way, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal small business owners would agree with us and support us on that.
One other question before I just maybe talk about your campaign, and that is you also deal with issues of jurisprudence, and you're a lawyer, and it has been a very difficult strain since some of these courts have not met. I know that in the particular area where you cover, Collin County, you've been able to create a couple of additional courts, but we need to get those courts back in session, and we need to get everything back to normal, whatever that new normal looks like, because that's a very significant issue as well, isn't it?
Well, as chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Texas House, I take this very seriously. Spend a lot of time working with our judges, and attorneys, experts, other legislators across the state. There's no question that our folks need access to courts, of course, not just with business disputes, but think about family law situations. Think about the woman that needs to get in and see a judge or in front of a jury to seek a protective order from a violent husband. I mean, these are questions that we've got to answer, and we've got to answer now. We're doing that around the clock to get our courts back up on their feet. I do want to, Kerby, commend and celebrate our judges all across the state who've been utilizing technology, innovative thinking, creative, outside the box ideas to make sure that their courts are continue to operate, that emergency matters and really important matters are continue to be heard in their courts. And because of them, we're on our feet, but with no question, we got to get juries and litigants back in the courts again, and we're well on our way to doing that. We really are.
Let's again talk about your campaign, because as people go to jeffleach.com, they can volunteer for your campaign. This has been kind of an interesting time. We had James Dickey on the other day, and I was saying, a week or two ago, we were supposed to be at the Texas State Convention. That didn't happen. And matter of fact, there's still a runoff that will determine who actually will run against you in the fall. So there's just a lot of question marks here. But it does seem that maybe some things are opening up. But how's the campaign going, and how can people get involved? And are we ever going to get back to to knocking on doors?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. Knocking on doors may be a ways down the road. I will tell you, I'm ready to knock on doors whenever we get the green light to do so.
Yes.
But just because we're not doing that right now doesn't mean we're not running a full-scale, full-throttle, well-oiled machine. Our campaign is off and running. We're communicating with voters every single day, and we're getting an incredible response. You're right. I don't know who our opponent is yet, but I promise whatever socially progressive, socialist, Democrat, liberal they put up against us, we're going to take on head on. We're going to talk very clearly about the messages and the issues that are important to the people of Texas, people in our community. We're going to talk to every voter, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, and everyone in between, and believe very strongly, we're not overconfident, very confident that we're going to win in November and continue our good work in the Texas House on behalf of our 190,000 constituents in Collin County.
Let's talk about what is available on your website. If you click on upcoming events, it's blank because that kind of just is an illustration of our life. But if you click on news, it shows all the different groups that have endorsed you. And really, in some respects, even though we can't meet people face to face, although my wife and I walk the streets anyway, and sometimes I end up being a pretty good precinct chairman just by running into people and talking to them as we're walking by, there are certainly texts and emails and all sorts of other ways that we can get involved. So talk about how people can get involved with you even right now, and certainly as maybe some of this opens up, they can get involved, especially for this fall campaign.
Well, I do want to encourage people to go to my website, jeffleach.com. Again, that's jeffleach.com. The most important part of the website, I hope, you'll read about what I stand for and my background and understand what we've accomplished, my ideas and vision going forward. But the most important part of my website, if you go to the section that's Meet Jeff or Contact Jeff, my cell phone number is there on my website. From day one, before I was an elected official, when Becky and I started running this campaign, we made sure that my personal contact information was on our website, easily available. It's on every single door knocker that we hand out, that we leave people. And so that's my personal cell phone, Kerby. I don't have more than one cell phone. Some politicians have burner cell phones and whatnot. I only got one. It's the one I'm talking to you on right now. So if folks need anything, if they've got questions or concerns or ideas, call me anytime. The best part of my job is connecting with our voters and constituents, and we've made it real easy for folks to do that.
Well, again, we appreciate you being on the program. Thank you so very much for representing House District 67, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, God bless. Keep up the great work.
We are going to take a break, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about, everything from the protests to the riots. And we will maybe focus a little bit of a time and attention really pretty much on Texas, although there's some national stories there as well. Then we'll, in the top of the hour, be talking with Lee Strobel. There is the LeeStrobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. Of course, you know him also as a professor of Christian thought at Houston Baptist University and a teaching pastor at Woodlands Church. So we have lots to talk about with him, and then we'll get back into all sorts of issues in the news. This is a very difficult weekend that we've been through, really a very difficult year. We'll do our best to try to make sense of some of that right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. How to make sense of what has unfolded over the last couple of days. Too difficult to even express in words, but let's give it a try, because that's what we're supposed to do here on this program. And just the tragic death of George Floyd, when you realize that the reason the police were called in the first place is because of possibly passing a forged $20 bill, and the loss of life for something as unimportant in some respects in terms of the big scene as that. And of course, the decision that took days, literally, for the Minnesota and the Minneapolis police to bring even charges. Andrew McCarthy, who we've had on this program in the past, actually was in the process of writing a piece saying, why haven't they brought charges? And finally they did. And he still wrote the piece that came out just a couple of days ago on how long it took. In some respects, it illustrates again the power of a video, but if we didn't have the video, it would be even worse. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later as we talk about what are some solutions. But just to think of an individual that died, and then the reaction, which I think in some respects was spontaneous, but now we can look back on some of these riots to know that some of those were staged. And that's another difficulty that I think we've all faced. If you've ever been involved in a protest or a rally or a march, and I've been in a number of those, many of them have been more pro-life marches, but there have been some others like that as well. I have more than one occasion looked around and said, I think some of the people with us here aren't really here for the same reason that we're here. And it began to be very obvious that that was the case. But then that kind of brings us to one of the points I did want to make this hour, and that is the first article that we've posted, which I think is very well written, and it says, this is easy. Don't excuse, defend, or encourage rioters. And I sometimes feel like one of my responsibilities here as a person that's been watching these unfold even since the 1960s, since I'm a little bit older probably than a lot of our listeners, and certainly a lot older than some of the millennials watching this now, is that we've seen this before, and that is how in some respects, if there are desires to not criticize, in this case it may be Antifa or others, there is just an attempt sometimes almost to excuse certain kinds of behavior. And so the way Kyle Smith says it is decade after decade, generation after generation, progressives keep making the same elementary mistake. They downplay, excuse, or in extreme cases even encourage urban riders. And he points out that the refrain, if nothing else, from even some of the Democrats. And by the way, there's some great YouTube videos I've seen where even some of the African Americans are saying, why are you doing this? They're yelling out to people that are either white radicals or whatever, saying, you know, some of them are saying, you're making it look like we did this and we didn't do this, or you're making it even more likely that Donald Trump's going to be reelected. We don't want that. And so there is really a need sometimes for some of those individuals, instead of trying to excuse it, say, wait a minute, stop what you're doing. You're hurting the cause, if nothing else. And once you start saying, well, really, destruction of property isn't that big of a deal. I've seen some people saying, for example, on some of these interviews, well, we can rebuild property. We can't rebuild the life of George Floyd. Agree with that, but that doesn't excuse it very easily as well. And probably the best illustration of that was one of the MSNBC reporters who's standing up, doing one of those stand-ups, cameras in his face, and he's talking about how overall these protests have not been unruly while you can see a fire burning in the background. And I could give you many other examples. Matter of fact, I have a commentary coming out next week in which I try to look at all of those, because some are saying, you know, this is just a protest, not a riot. And really, again, holding a sign, marching the street is one thing. Throwing rocks at law enforcement, breaking windows, stopping cars, beating up bystanders is something very different. Some of them suggest, well, property damage is just an example of free speech. And as I said before, just think about if all of a sudden you're breaking their property, burning their car, then all of a sudden they'd have a different viewpoint. By the way, there's an NBC commentator that I'm going to read from a little bit later in the National Hour that illustrates that. And then, of course, the argument that has been made even here in Dallas is, well, we can't attain any justice because it's a rigged system. Well, I saw a number of commentators, I'll call out just Domingo Garcia, but there were a number of others that were saying, just think about what you just said. We are in a city, Dallas, which has an African-American mayor. It has an African-American police chief, and you're saying the system is rigged. This is a place which is trying to bring about some change. And again, explain to me, maybe I'm missing something, why destroying, whether it's burning down a Wendy's or the police department there in Minnesota, or even here in Dallas, just looting a Whole Foods, how that advances any kind of justice. And I think we, of course, know the answer. And that brings me to my second article by DeRoy Murdoch, And he is African-American, and as an individual that, again, takes us through the horrible story of course, George Floyd and what happened there. And we'll skip over that since we know the story. And then points out that then you start seeing all this violence erupting, and the example he uses of this elderly woman in a wheelchair sprayed with a fire extinguisher and having, of course, nothing to do one way or the other with what was unfolding there, how the arsonist turned AutoZone, the Minnehaha Lake wine and spirit store, or 14 other structures into cinders, and how they eventually the police had to desert the 3rd precinct headquarters because they were able to breach this. And some of these stories sound like what we would have with there's a terrorist attack in a particular part of another country. Like when people overrun an embassy in maybe the 2nd or 3rd world. And this is just incredible how this is played out. And then he focuses on a story that I heard him talk about on the air the other day of this African-American firefighter who actually plowed all of his life savings into this sports bar. And then, unfortunately, had to keep it closed because of the pandemic, and the plan was for him to open that sports bar today, but of course the grand opening never happened because they absolutely burned it down to the ground. Has no insurance. His life, as DeRoy points out, is a smoldering ruin, and as a result, it explains all of this to a TV crew, even while looters are tiptoeing through the embers of his American dream in the background, and just a good illustration of what has unfolded here and the need for us to bring some level of control. So that is, of course, one aspect of that, and I thought I would spend just a little bit of time, and I may come back to it later, on just the number of misstatements from people that are in positions of authority. One of those I saw very early on, and it came from, in particular, the governor of Minnesota, also the mayor of Minnesota, but also from the Department of Public Safety. All of them were singing off the same song sheet, but it was the wrong song sheet. I'll just read from the spokesperson for the Public Safety of Minnesota Department. We've got intel reports that have been confirmed that I cannot say have been confirmed, but we have cells of white supremacists. One of those individuals actually even suggested that it wasn't just white supremacists, but it was Russians, if you can believe this. And in case you actually believe some of that, let me just give you what eventually was surfaced from the common sense that came from the lieutenant governor, who said, although these claims have been made, the civil arrest list provided by the public information officer, for example, of St. Paul, showed that 12 of the 18 people arrested from Thursday through Saturday were from Minnesota. So this argument that they were coming from out of town. As a matter of fact, there was one claim, I'll read this after the break, that all of the people that were engaged in the riots were from out of town. Later changed it to 80%, and turns out that maybe even 20% is too high. And then the intelligence reports from the colleagues indicate that the hardcore protesters in Minnesota are far left or anarchist, and that far-right groups have not made a significant appearance. So you have a lot of statements that were made by people that are in front of a microphone, and they just say what they wish it was, but couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge that some of the people maybe that even voted for you are the ones looting and setting fires. We'll come back and get into a little bit more of this because there's a lot to cover today, and I just want to look at how we have, in some cases, been well served by some people in political leadership, very poorly served by others. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then again at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Lee Strobel, and then we'll get back into the news because we certainly want to talk about the context of the death of George Floyd in light of so many others that have taken place. You can think of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Freddie Gray, and, of course, another one in Minneapolis, Philando Castile, and, of course, even for those of us in Dallas here, the accidental shooting of Botham Jean, and so many others that have been, if you will, a spark that has ignited all of this. And so when there is turmoil in the streets, when there is panic, there is a need to really make sure that those individuals that we have elected provide leadership. There have been lots of people criticizing this president, and we'll certainly get to that in the national hour. But I thought just for a minute we might also go back to Minnesota, because we've seen some things that are of great concern. Jim Garrity puts it this way. He said, I never thought I'd actually make these statements, but he says Glenn Greenwald said, until people start forming beliefs based on evidence rather than the narrative that's most comforting, our discussion will continue to be toxic trash. Now, the reason Glenn Greenwald said that is he was just horrified to see the mayor of St. Paul, which is, of course, you have Minneapolis and St. Paul, declaring on Saturday that every person arrested in the riots in his city was from out of state. Every person. Anytime you hear somebody say all or everyone, you know it's not right, because you hardly ever get 100% of anything, right? Then he amended it to 80%. I just gave you the numbers a minute ago. I'm not even sure it was 20%. So that's the mayor of St. Paul. Let me give you another example, because Jim Garrity gives us quite a few. You have the governor of Minnesota, as well as the mayor of Minneapolis, and that's Tim Walz and Jacob Fry, who on Saturday said that, again, the arrest reports actually show, again, that these individuals were out-of-towners. Well, let's look at Minneapolis now. 47 out of the 57 actually had Minnesota addresses. So, again, doesn't fit very well. But as Jim Garrity points out, the Minnesota's government leaders simply did not want to acknowledge the possibility that members of their own communities, and I would add something he doesn't, even people that may have voted you in as governor or mayor, could do something so destructive and so callous. And sometimes it's just difficult to confront that that's what we have here in this community. And I think even in the Dallas area, we say, I thought maybe we'd have a little more civility. And then we see some of the things that transpire there, and recognize that if you have any doubt about the fact that there is human sinfulness and human depravity, all you have to do is watch some of the broadcast on television or just go out in the streets. Now, interestingly enough, we also have, of course, Mr. Walz, the governor, Tim Walz, making the same statement as well, that he was sure that these were white supremacist groups. But again, you can go back and look at the numbers here. The vast majority of some of these perpetrators were white, but they were anarchists, or actually in some cases Antifa regalia. Now, it's possible that just because you see somebody wearing black, just because they're wearing a black mask, just because they're putting one of those anarchist A's, it's possible that they're not anarchists, okay? So I'll be the first to admit that sometimes we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. But I think that pretty much gives you a pretty good indication of what indeed they were doing. And again, as he points out, there were a number of young people there who weren't there to actually protest. They weren't necessarily there to advance the Antifa agenda. They were maybe driven by something other than a left-of-center ideology, like, I don't know, maybe greed, selfishness, violence, maybe the desire to feel powerful at the moment or whatever. But again, as Jim Garrity points out, we put these people in positions of leadership, and we are going to see people from the president all the way down asking for our vote this November. And I don't remember if the governor's running, but I suspect if not, will be in 2 years. And those are questions that need to be asked. And he said every one of these people in elected office asked for their jobs, put considerable effort in telling the public they were prepared to handle the difficult duties that came with it. And one of those duties is communicating accurate information to the public. And so, again, not every crime leads to the suspect you already dislike. Sometimes the trail leads right back to the people you thought better of, who you thought were on the right path, the people you thought weren't capable of this. And so this has been, in some respects, a bit of a wake-up call. Well, what can be done? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, we'll focus on more of this a little bit later, but the president has decided to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. That certainly has shown up. One of the other articles we've posted here is by Andrew McCarthy, in which he points out that isn't necessary to actually engage in law enforcement. But you do have the Attorney General William Barr saying in many places it appears that the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchists and far-left extremists using Antifa-like tactics. And again, we have to be careful not to assume that anybody built or dressed like that is the case. But Andrew McCarthy says, look, I've seen this before. It's back in 1990s when I was prosecuting the jihadists that were trying to actually blow up the World Trade Center back then, and have seen this same kind of action as well. So he said when Attorney General Barr's mention of the violent agenda happened, it sort of pinged my antenna, and if nothing else, makes the case that for society to flourish, the rule of law must assert itself, justice must be done, which brings anti-American domestic terrorists to heel. And so that is sort of the argument being made right now in terms of Antifa. But I thought it was kind of interesting as well. Dan Bongino has said, even as you had one PBS reporter claiming that there was absolutely no evidence of what President Trump had said, that Antifa was involved, you could see at the time somebody spraying an anarchist A on the building. So again, sometimes these just don't help your cause very much. And Dan Bongino put it this way: if a group of conservatives appeared regularly in liberal cities wearing black masks, carrying weapons and incendiaries, breaking windows, setting fires, attacking innocents, looting, there'd be an outcry in the media to shut them down. And he says, actually, you don't even have to use this hypothetical conservative group, because look at the response one time when a number of people protested in Michigan just a few weeks ago. And so why is it that you find individuals still trying to defend them? Well, his argument is that CNN's Don Lemon was still making excuses for the violence, even as recently, he says, as last night. And maybe that's simply because he recognizes some of those people are necessary to defeat Donald Trump in the fall. So we need to see some of this with a level of discernment, and we certainly need to pray for the incredible amount of violence that has broken out in the cities of America, even in the city where we broadcast from. And so, if nothing else, certainly our time, our prayers, and our involvement in trying to bring some peace in the midst of some tremendous turmoil that we are facing. And we'll talk more about where some of this anger, some of these concerns come from, some of the tension and anxiety. But we need to take a break, and so we will do so. We'll talk with Lee Strobel. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the other action items that can be taken. How can we address this issue of police violence? How can we address some of these anarchists? We have a lot more to talk about. All that coming up right after these important messages.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today on this Monday edition of Point of View. It has been quite a disturbing weekend, and we are going to spend some time over the next couple of hours really get into that. But first, we will do an interview before we get into some of the issues associated with, and what a year it's been already. We've talked about a pandemic. We've talked about protests now over the weekend, then riots, and, of course, the whole issue of racial tensions and police brutality and so many other issues we're going to address. Some of our political leaders have really failed us and have not communicated accurately. There has been a designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization, and we'll even talk about possible solutions. How can we address some of these issues that are very relevant in the death of George Floyd? And when we think about this, we're also, of course, talking about all sorts of other things that have happened in the past, whether we mention Michael Brown or Eric Gardner, or Freddie Gray, or Philando Castile. So we're going to get into all of that, but I thought first it would be appropriate to go with some of the things we did have planned for today. And one of those is to do an interview with our good friend Lee Strobel, because we wanted to announce about the LeeStrobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. You know him as, of course, an author of a number of great books. The Case for Christ, probably the one that is best known, but more than 10 million copies of different books and things that he has written. An individual that is a graduate of the University of Missouri in journalism, went to Yale Law School as well, and got a master's in law degree, and was a journalist at the Chicago Tribune, and then became a Christian and has been at every place from Saddleback Community Church to even more recently Woodlands Church. And we have talked with him about all sorts of different books. I think the last time we talked about his great book on the case for miracles, but wanted to talk about this new Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. So, Lee Strobel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks, Kerby. Great to talk with you. How are you doing in the midst of this turmoil going on?
Always gives me something to talk about, that is for sure. And
Boy,
as a journalist, watching even the coverage of that, any thoughts? I mean, obviously, we're all so saddened, and I mean, in my heart just is so sad for the death of George Floyd, and even all these other individuals we can mention, even those kids that even on the streets of Chicago this weekend were killed in different situations. But at the same time, if nothing else, I think we really need to encourage our listeners to develop some level of discernment as they watch news reports and they hear all sorts of pundits making all sorts of statements.
Yeah, it's really difficult these days to tell who is a reporter and who's a commentator. That line has been blurred so much that I was switching around to a lot of different coverage and seeing quite a bit of opinion coming forth and not as many facts as I was hoping for. But I really think this whole situation just reminds us of our need for revival in America and an awakening in America. I think of the story of my friend, and you may know him as well, Tom Torrance from the Colson Center. A great example of how the gospel can transform a life of a racist to someone who is a lover of all people. You know, Tom was a terrorist for the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1960s. He was convicted of conspiracy to bomb the house of a civil rights leader, went to prison for that, was recalcitrant in prison. He ended up escaping. There was a hail of gunfire. One of his fellow escapees was killed. He went back to solitary confinement for, I think, 3 years. And during that time, he found Jesus Christ. The gospel transformed his life. He was ultimately released from prison, got his Ph.D., became pastor of a multiracial church, and is now with the Colson Center from Chuck Colson's legacy out there in Washington, D.C., and a great example of the power of the gospel to transform lives and transform people's attitudes.
What a great story, and if nothing else, just a good illustration as we get into this issue of race, racial relations, racial stereotypes, and the power of the gospel to change, to become new creatures, as it says in 2 Corinthians 5:17. So we want to focus some time and attention on what you have developed, and so if people go to the website, they can click on the picture there of Lee Strobel. That will take you to your website, but if they scan down, the next one actually takes you to Colorado Christian University and the LeeStrobel Center. So tell us a little bit more about how this came about.
We're very excited about this because I know your listeners are very into apologetics, evidence for the faith, not only to deepen our own faith so that we'll be more willing to share it with others, but also to reach people who are not believers. And so what we've done is we're creating undergraduate and graduate level courses. There'll be a total of 181 courses in total. Right now we're launching our first, I think we have 30 courses coming out this fall, all online, so people can do it from the comfort of their home. And we have a variety of different courses, things like the case against atheism, Islam and Christianity, a whole course on religious doubt, a course on objections to Christianity, on the resurrection, on world religions and cults, on science and faith, and so forth. So a lot of fascinating courses that people can take, whether they want to pursue a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or if they just want to take a couple of courses just to increase their own skill level in sharing Jesus with others and defending the faith as being true. So we've got a team of 30 PhDs who are developing these courses. And it's like herding cats to get 30 PhDs organized for something like this, but we've managed to do it. And we're thrilled because we really believe, as my friend J. Warner Wallace says, that evangelism in the 21st century is spelled apologetics.
I would agree. You know, one of the people that is on this page is Mark Middleberg, and it's been a while since we've had him on the program, so if you see him, tell him that we'd love to get him back on the program, but he's kind of the executive director, and so I know he's also doing some herding of cats as well, isn't he?
He is. Mark is awesome. He and I have been best buddies since 1987. And written several books together, and so he's awesome. And I think he's probably the greatest living strategist in the area of church-based evangelism. And he's probably trained more people in evangelism than anybody I know. He's trained almost 2 million people. So he's a tremendous asset and a great apologist with a degree in philosophy of religion from Trinity Divinity School. And he's heading up our center, and we found a great home at Colorado Christian University, which has a deep heritage of evangelism. Don Sweeting, the president, is the son of George Sweeting, who, of course, was an evangelical icon of the 20th century.
So, again, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then, of course, we'll get back into the news, but during the break, this is a great time for you to go to ccu.edu/Strobel Center, or it's really much simpler. Just go to pointofview.net. As you go there, you will see two things. There's a link that you can click on that will take you to LeeStrobel.com, so you can see some material that we'll talk about in just a minute. And if you scroll down, you will see the other one that will take you to the LeeStrobel Center, which focuses on evangelism and applied apologetics, and especially at a time when so many of us are thinking, probably not going to be able to go anywhere, you can still learn apologetics and really learn how to be a very effective witnesser and a very effective apologist simply online. So we'll talk more about how you can participate right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of of the unnecessary tragedies of this pandemic has been the deaths of so many elderly patients in nursing homes, especially in New York. One Democratic assemblyman who represents Queens criticized the state because it failed to protect the lives of the most vulnerable members of our community. He went on to say the fact that we maintained and pushed COVID-positive patients into facilities that were not equipped to handle them, it was a fatal error. You know, as sad as that decision was, what is even more concerning is how and why that decision was made. There was a directive that was issued that a state official says, quote, was meant to protect those infected with the coronavirus from discrimination. Now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, in a recent article, explains what that official-sounding phrase about discrimination really meant. You know, it appears that New York wanted to create a new protected class. That would be a patient with COVID-19. Now, the guidance issued by the state seems to prohibit even testing a patient to see if he or she was still contagious. It proclaimed, quote, no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to the nursing home solely based on a confirmed or suspected diagnosis of COVID-19, unquote. So New York had more than 5,600 nursing home deaths. The governor and many other health officials admit that their policy was a deadly decision. But only recently have some begun to understand that this fatal decision was not based on the science. Apparently, it was based on a misguided attempt to implement a social justice ideal of non-discrimination against patients infected with the coronavirus, who then spread it to thousands of other patients. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, continue our conversation with Lee Strobel. By the way, if you have a comment or a question perhaps about this, maybe you're saying, well, I'd like to take some courses, but I'd like to know a little bit more. Maybe you have a apologetics question. Well, he'll be with us for just another segment, and then we're going to move on to all sorts of issues in the news. But if you just joined us, we've been talking about the fact that we have the LeeStrobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. It's at Colorado Christian University. It's been a few years since I've been up there. I've actually been involved with the radio station associated with the school. Back then it was an institute, and it's just been great to hear about this great opportunity. But Lee, let's talk about a little bit more. Some people might say, I really hadn't thought about getting a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. What's entailed in trying to pursue something like this? Because in some respects, any of our listeners, if they have access to a computer, and I'm assuming almost all of them do, they have the ability to be trained by some of the best apologists in the country.
Yeah, it's so easy these days through online education, and which is not, by the way, a second-class education. I mean, online these days, you're dealing with a kind of a Zoom setup with a professor, with a class, and you're really interacting. And so each of our courses goes over 5 weeks. And so it's like one night a week for 5 weeks, plus, of course, there's other things you do in the interim and books and so forth. But it's an opportunity to do this while you're doing something else. So if you're working in a career and you want to do this on the side, that becomes much more easier to accomplish. I just think that these days, and you know this, Kerby, that apologetics is changing, and that's a good thing. It's changing with the times. It's more of a dialogue than a monologue. It's where we do more listening than talking. It's where we really want to answer the questions of people they have rather than the questions we want to answer. And so we want to bring people up to speed on that. That's why we use the word applied apologetics. We want to train people not to become ivory tower academics, not that there's anything wrong with ivory tower academics, but we want to train people who will be in the marketplace of ideas. People are going to share their faith and defend it over the backyard fence with a neighbor, but those are going to do, Kerby, what you do and do radio, or they're going to do podcasts, or they're going to write books, or they're going to be active on social media. We want people who are going to be in the marketplace of ideas, sharing Jesus and defending the faith as being true to make a difference for Christ. And that's why we added that word applied for apologetics, is to kind of let people know that this is not ephemeral stuff. This is stuff you can put to use. This is stuff that will make a difference today in how you share and defend your faith. We even have a course on studies in apologetics in the arts, in film, in music, and in visual arts, and in social media, to help prepare people to be engaged in those arenas, to create media for the next generation that's going to present the message of Christ in a creative and biblically accurate way.
You know, you've been a Christian for some time and been involved in apologetics ever since that time. And one of the things that I'm excited about is that, first of all, we have so much more coming in our direction. Yes. So that's encouraging. But also, as you just pointed out, in terms of evangelism and apologetics is different in the 21st century, we have a lot more postmodernism. We're kind of in this post-truth idea. So it's good that we have so much evidence, but we also have to begin to retool and maybe even rethink some of our techniques because yes. the audience is different. So that's why even some people that said, I've read Lee Strobel's book, I've read Josh McDowell, or, I think I read a Norm Geisler book one time, or, I heard J. Warner Wallace speak once. I got it all. No, there's a lot more that we need to learn in this 21st century world, don't we?
That's really true. That's why we have courses on things like secularism and modern society. We have courses on advanced social action and evangelism, and truth and skepticism. We have a whole course on that. And we even have one on critical thinking and logic. So we can think critically, and we can do what you do, Kerby, so masterfully, which is to look at the world through the Christian lens, through the Christian worldview, and be able to interact with events as they happen, to be able to analyze them from a Christian perspective. We want to train people how to do that. And we want to be very involved with local churches. We really believe local churches are the answer. And so, we believe that every church needs to have an evangelism point leader, whether it's a full-time, part-time, or volunteer position, under the direction of the senior pastor, who really leads that charge and provides leadership. He or she doesn't do evangelism on behalf of the church as much as trains the entire church how to naturally and effectively share their faith and create events and opportunities to be able to reach out into the community. We need someone who stays up late at night and dreams this. The senior pastor can't do it all. And one thing that Mark and I did when we were involved with a church, we found a volunteer who was a seminary student and said, why don't you be in charge of apologetics? And he took that ball and ran with it. He later went on to get his Ph.D. In philosophy of religion. He's now chairman of the theology and philosophy department at Bethel University. I've written about 20 books on philosophy and on evidence for the faith. Chad Meister is his name.
Oh, sure.
So, you can groom this next generation to be the apologists of the future and to make a difference not just for today, but for tomorrow and the years to come.
If people want to get involved with you, there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm thinking some pastors might say, I like your idea of having somebody in the church, and I'm assuming that they could contact you, or maybe even better, Mark, to find out about that. And so first of all, for the pastors, but second of all, for our listeners who are saying, okay, you've convinced me, I might like to enroll, but what does it take? What do I need to do? What's my next step?
Yeah, if they go to StrobelCenter.com or go through your website to get to ours, they can use my name, Strobel, in the application process, and then the application is totally free. And we have counselors there who will get on the phone with you and explain everything. get you set up, answer all your questions and so forth. So you can go on there and just kind of fill out a thing, and you'll be connected with a live counselor from Colorado Christian who can talk you through everything. So it's very easy. You don't have to be a technophile to be able to use online education. Even old folks like me can do it. And so if I can do it, anybody can do it. I mean, my IT department at my house is my granddaughter who lives around the corner. She's 11, and she's my IT department. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. And we've had nothing but just great interactions with these scholars who said, this is a great opportunity to put legs to what we've done. Too long, philosophers have been in that ivory tower and not been equipping the body of Christ and everyday Christians to be prepared to give an answer for the reason for the hope that we have. And so all these PhDs we're working with, they're just so excited about connecting with real-life people to be able to equip them and prepare them to share and defend the faith.
Well, let me again encourage you to go to Strobel Center, and we have a couple of links that you can follow there. There is a video. It's about a minute and a half long, so you can kind of watch that, and you might even want to post it on the website that you have. Maybe you have a Facebook page or Twitter page, or you have your own website, whatever it might be. Or you might know somebody listening that's not listening right now that you say, this would be exactly up that person's alley, and to send it to them. And one other thing I might commend to you, which is also at the Strobel Center, but you can also find it at, of course, Lee Strobel's website, and that is about a 50-minute presentation. I think it's 49 minutes and a little bit on the case for miracles. And ever since you were on to talk about your book, I've seen some of the updates that you've provided on Twitter, some more of those stories, and it is pretty incredible. So if nothing else, you have, of course, over the years talked about, the case for everything, the case for Christ and the case for grace and the case for Easter and Christmas and on and on and on. But the case for miracles, that's been kind of another one of those remarkable books, and it's been great to have you research that and give some really incredible stories that defy naturalistic explanation and certainly point to a supernatural creator. So thank you for posting those, and if you want to know more, we have all of that on our website, pointofview.net. And Lee Strobel, keep us up to date, because I'm excited about what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Kerby. You're awesome. Thank you for what you're doing. It is so important. Your influence is growing all over the country and beyond, and we appreciate you. That's what we text and say, Kerby. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Well, he's up there in Colorado now, so it sounds a little different. But again, Colorado Christian University. And if you ever want to visit up there, I think that's a great facility by his way. But you can just go online. And so we've got all the information on the Strobel Center at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We have a lot to cover. We've had a pandemic. We've had protests. We have riots. We have all sorts of racial tension, police brutality, and much more. So we're going to get into all of that in the next couple of hours. And, of course, we'll be getting into it all through the week as we get into some aspects of that. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we lament the death of George Floyd and the prosecution that needs to take place of the individual. Now, I'll even a little bit later talk about the individuals that were not only engaged in his death, but were bystanders and did nothing about that on the police force. And I'll have more to say about that a little bit later when we talk about what can be done in terms of police brutality. But before we get to all of those issues, it just has been such a sad week in so many ways, because we first heard about the tragic death of George Floyd right after it took place on Monday. We had the video. How many times have some of us seen it? As a matter of fact, some of the various news outlets have decided only to show a picture rather than to show it one more time and dwell on it. But if you add that to the deaths of so many other individuals like Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Freddie Gray, and even there in Minneapolis, Philando Castile, we recognize how this was in some respects a spark that set it off. But in some respects, it also relates to what we've been going through. And I was encouraged to see at least one article that appeared in, of all places, the Slate, suggesting that maybe after months of being locked down in the pandemic and having so much frustration of being locked down, and then 40 million people losing their jobs, this was kind of the spark that brought all of that to the fore. And since then, there's some other people that have written about this. Carol Lieberman, psychiatrist, said it is no longer this having to do just with Black Lives Matter or even with the death of George Floyd. It is a world that is, in pain, obviously, over losing jobs, of losing loved ones, of being fearful of this pandemic, and really being deprived of the American dream, and finally just simply saying, I'm not going to take it anymore. And so Carol Lieberman goes on to say that in some respects what we're seeing now is people have regressed to almost a primitive, barbaric state of mind, giving vent to any kind of pent-up hostility, frustration against anyone and everyone. They don't know, they don't care, she says, what others stand for anymore. They just want to express their own rage. And if you've seen this in terms of everything from police brutality to just even attacking individuals, institutions, stores that have nothing to do with the death of George Floyd, and I think we all have understood that to be the case. And at a national level, to show how extreme this has become, we had the President of the United States actually rushed into the bunker. Now, whatever you think about the president, there's only been a few times in our history where we have actually taken the President of the United States into the Emergency Operations Center. One of those was during 9/11, and that was where they took the vice president at that time, Dick Cheney. If you're not familiar with it, I've got a picture of it here. It's 5 stories below the White House. It's got vault-type doors. It's got a secret lift. You have biometric access. And the President of the United States was moved to the bunker before, in this case, more than 50, I'd heard 60 before, but the number now being used is 50 Secret Service agents were injured. And as a result, this was constructed back in the days of World War II to protect Franklin Roosevelt against any kind of hit, and eventually was upgraded to protect against a direct nuclear hit. But here you have the President of the United States being put into a bunker. For those of you that travel to Washington, D.C., maybe they'll clean it up soon, but I've got pictures here from the National Park Service defacing the wall next to the Lincoln Memorial, defacing the World War II Memorial. as a variety of others, the toppling of some things along the way. Then, if it isn't bad enough that these various memorials were attacked, you have the defacing of the Washington National Cathedral, and probably the saddest of all is the historic St. John's Church. That is the rather small church, which is there off of Lafayette Square. It is a place that we've over the years seen, for example, most recently Barack Obama and other presidents that have gone in there. I don't know if Donald Trump has. I think he has. And it goes all the way back, I believe, to at least the early part of the 19th century. Don't know if it was part of that as well, but every single president, it says, since James Madison has sat in that church. And I guess, yes, I do remember now that Donald Trump has been there. So every president has been in that church, and it was set ablaze. So this, if nothing else, shows that we're dealing with so many things in this year 2020 that are unprecedented. The pandemic has been part of that. You might remember when we had Penna Dexter on here and said that if you go to Israel, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was closed down during the pandemic. Last time it was closed down, during the Black Death, almost 1,000 years ago. Again, how many times has the President of the United States been taken into the bunker? And that probably tells you what we are dealing with in so many different ways here in the year 2020 is unprecedented. So one of the things I wanted to address, and it's our first article on the website, is an article that has a rather provocative title, Don't Excuse, Defend, or Encourage Rioters. And it's a piece by Kyle Smith pointing out that something I've noticed as well. If you've been around for a long time, and I've been in either as a guest host or as the host of this program since 1986. So that, I think is 34 years? That's a third of a century. That feels like it some days. And you've seen some things over time. And if you're young, you probably haven't seen so many. And I can even go back to some of the race riots in the 1960s. We had some others that even developed during the 1980s. But one of the things that is disturbing, and Kyle Smith talks about this, is generation after generation, progressives keep making the same elementary mistake. They downplay, excuse, and in extreme cases even encourage urban rioters. And this was not what we needed. As bad as it is that the legitimate protests, the legitimate non-violent protests were co-opted, sometimes in a few cases fairly quickly, by those who were wanting to riot either because they wanted to make a statement, and as we'll talk about in just a few minutes, Antifa has now been identified as a terrorist organization, or just as individuals angry about everything that is transpired even during the lockdown, angry about the racial violence, angry about police brutality, for whatever reason, and there were mixed motives for the crowds, we started seeing these riots. And as Kyle Smith points out, the Democrats and the media should have been saying, stop doing what you're doing. You're hurting your cause. But nevertheless, what we start seeing are individuals that were trying to make excuses. Some of them, for example, would simply say, well, this is just a protest, not a riot. And there are all sorts of examples that you can use, but perhaps the one that caught almost everybody's attention is where you had this MSNBC reporter doing a stand-up in front of a camera, talking about the fact that the crowd has been generally unruly, while there's a fire burning in the building is in the background being burned. And, of course, you can talk about the destruction of that particular 3rd Precinct Minnesota Police Headquarters and some of those others. So some have simply put it into, well, this is only a protest, it's not riots. Well, it got out of hand. And for anybody that can't make the distinction, holding a sign, marching in the streets, having a vigil, kneeling in prayer, that's a protest. Throwing rocks at law enforcement, breaking windows, stopping cars, beating up bystanders, okay, that's a riot. And in case you did not understand that, that is the case. Some have said, well, it's property damage, and I've seen a number of interviews where people will simply say, well, that's just free expression. We can always rebuild property. As I'll point out in just a minute in one of my other articles, matter of fact, it's our second article we'll look at after the break. Sometimes these are establishments even owned by African Americans who put their life savings in it that saw it go up in flames. So, again, it's easy to be a little bit philosophical about that until it becomes your car or your store. And I'll get some examples of that maybe in the next hour that I've been able to glean from there as well. And then some have simply said, well, this is the only way to get the attention of individuals because it's a rigged system, which we'll come back after the break and talk about a little bit more. But in some of these places where the supposedly system is rigged, the mayor is African American, the police chief is African American, and nevertheless, the riots continue. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that we will be talking with Jeff Myers at the top of the hour. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. But one of the articles we've posted here by Kyle Smith, Don't Excuse, Defend, or Encourage Rioters. And I thought it was kind of interesting because he also quotes from Al Sharpton, who at one point was talking about how the damage done specifically to black-owned stores was so reckless, which is correct. I mean, it's so sad, and I'm going to, matter of fact, talk about one example of that in just a minute. But again, I love how Kyle Smith points out that do you really expect rioters in the midst of all of the vandalism to stop and look up property records? Well, of course not. And even when you start seeing some of the things that were destroyed, Target, AutoZone, the Minnehaha Lake Wine and Spirit Store, and all sorts of others, won't the riots do massive damage to the value of your property, the cost of your insurance going forward, and the general viability of your business? What about the African American people who lost their jobs when a Target or an AutoZone or other businesses were destroyed? And so, again, it's kind of interesting to be very philosophical when you're a commentator very far away from some of this. And in the next hour, I'm going to give you some examples of those who even spoke out and said, let it burn, until all of a sudden the rioters got close to their home and then they kind of changed their tune. Let's get to another issue real quickly, and that is the second article that I've posted here by DeRoy Murdoch. He is African American and points out that what we are seeing here is just such a sad injustice, if you will, to George Floyd and what happened to him, because indeed you have so many issues of injustice piled upon the initial injustice, and not the least of which is the decision that was actually launched fairly early in this riot in Minneapolis to have the police officers desert the 3rd Precinct headquarters because the rioters breached it. And it tended to look a little bit like what happened in Iran in the 1970s when you had people taking over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Because it had kind of a military motif. I mentioned Slate just a minute ago. There was one columnist that said, well, burning down the 3rd Precinct police headquarters might be an appropriate response to police brutality. So you even had some people making that case. But to me, one of the saddest stories which came out, and he documents this, so in case you'd like to read it, maybe post it on your web page or your Facebook page or put it up as a Twitter post or something like that, of this African-American firefighter, Kerby Bala, who plowed all of his life savings into this sports bar there in Minneapolis. And he was hoping to begin to launch it on Monday, because originally he had the plan to open it, and then, of course, the pandemic shut it all down. So the grand opening was planned for today. Well, arsonists burned it down, and he, in the descriptions that he gave to the TV crew, he said, I have no insurance. My life now is just a smoldering ruin. And some of this while, some of the looters are tiptoeing through the embers of his American dream right there in daylight. And it's just a sad commentary, again, as DeRoy Murdoch points out, of the injustice done to George Floyd is horrible. The injustice that's been piled on it since then is awful as anything we can possibly imagine. And so I thought I'd bring it to one other piece, and that is we would expect our elected officials to do a good job. But Jim Garrity, who I oftentimes tend to quote, says he never expected to quote Glenn Greenwald, who said, until people start forming beliefs based upon evidence rather than the narrative that's most comforting, our discussion and discourse will be toxic trash. What Glenn Greenwald was talking about in particular were some of the statements made by the two mayors, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the governor. Let's take the St. Paul mayor, first of all, Melvin Carter, who declared on Saturday that every person arrested in the riots in his city was from out of state. Tends not to be quite accurate on that regard. Later, he said 80%. Well, here's the numbers. The civil arrest list, which I have in front of me here, showed that 12 of the 18 people arrested from Thursday through Saturday morning were from Minnesota. So I'm not even sure 20% there. And I love what Jim Garrity says. When you start having people in positions of authority making such sweeping statements, he said our spidey sense should start tingling. That's a reference, of course, to Spider-Man. You start saying that just can't possibly be true. So that's the mayor of St. Paul. Okay, let's go to the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, as well as the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. And they made similar comments as well about these are outside agitators. But again, the data from the arrest report show that in the county where this is located, 47 of the 57 people arrested through at least Saturday morning had a Minnesota address. And so, again, the point he's making is that oftentimes people are just making it up, or they can't believe that there are individuals in their community that would do something. And to quote Jim Garrett, he said, Minnesota's government leaders simply did not want to acknowledge the possibility that members of their own communities could do something so destructive and so callous. Of course, we've heard a lot of individuals, whether it is the mayors, the governors, I think even, the mayor of Seattle and others, they were saying, well, these are all white supremacists. And if nothing else, again, Jim Garrity says, but the vast majority of these were young whites in anarchist or Antifa regalia and young blacks and minorities. The young people you see in these videos are unlikely to be white nationalists or pawns of white nationalists. As a matter of fact, again, this came a little bit later from one of the security consultants. Intelligence reports from his colleagues indicate that most of the hardcore protesters in Minnesota and Minneapolis are far left or anarchist, and that far-right groups have not made a significant appearance. And let's recognize that some of them may not have even had any kind of ideology. They might have been driven by something other than a left-of-center ideology. You know, it could be something like, greed, selfishness, anger, violence, the desire to feel powerful, or whatever. But Jim Garrity ends by saying every one of these officials in elected office asked for their jobs and put considerable effort into telling the people that they were prepared to handle the different duties that came with it. One of the duties is communicating accurate information to the public. And so, again, not every crime leads back to a suspect that you might have disliked. Sometimes the trail leads right back to the people you thought better of, the people you thought were on the right path, the people who you thought weren't capable of doing this. And I think as Christians, we come to this understanding that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is human sin nature, there is human depravity, and that is certainly the case. We come back from the break. I want to talk about the designation in the last part of our next hour, to focus on Antifa in particular. Were they guilty of taking a spark that blew up and turning these legitimate, nonviolent protests into violent riots? I think the answer is yes. Was the president legitimate in actually identifying Antifa as a terrorist group? There have been some people on both sides of the aisle that have agreed or disagreed with that, so we'll get into that. And we'll talk about some other solutions, because, after all, what started this was police brutality. And I have some suggestions on what needs to take place in that regard as well. Let's take a break, though. We need to come back. And first, we'll spend a little bit of time talking with Jeff Myers, the Summit Virtual, which we'll talk about. And then we'll get back into some of these issues in the news. Many of the articles I'm quoting from are on our website, so go to pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Summit Virtual, and we'll get into what that means in just a minute. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news before we wind it down for today. And let me just say that if you have a young person going off to college, and of course we've really raised some questions as to whether or not 20 million college students will show up in on the campus in the fall. We'll have to see how that all plays itself out for a variety of different reasons. Some may not want to take classes online. Some may want to take a gap program or whatever. But nevertheless, if they're heading out into college or heading out into the world, they really need to understand what they believe, which is one of the reasons why we've so encouraged you to make sure that you send a young person to Summit Ministries or to the Pro Ministries college prep or something, or maybe all of the above, just to get them ready. And so there is an opportunity here to actually go online right now through what's called Summit Virtual, a number of sessions taking place in June and July, and we wanted you to know about that and know how to register for those. So in order to give you some perspective, we thought we would come back to our good friend, Dr. Jeff Myers, President of Summit Ministries, hold his Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Denver, individual that has been a professor at various Christian schools and is now heading up what takes place at Summit, author of 14 different books, and an individual that is going to kind of educate us about how you can actually have a young person go online and begin to be fortified in their Christian faith. So, Dr. Jeff Myers, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, it's great to hear your voice, and I know you've got a crazy busy news day, but I'm glad we get a chance to talk about how we can help our kids through all of this, because they are going to bear the brunt of our mismanagement of our whole society, and they're worried sick about it.
Well, and again, let's tell your story, because you headed off to Summit. I think there were maybe some heel marks in the back of the room. Nevertheless, but because of that, you've always had a great appreciation for what you've been able to accomplish there at Summit Ministries.
Well, that's right. Summit Ministries operates out of an antique hotel in a little hippie town nestled at the foot of Pikes Peak. I visited the program when I was a teenager, thinking about walking away from the church. And I told David Noble, the founder of the ministry, I hope you have a lot of answers, because I have a lot of questions, which is a very rude thing for a 17-year-old to say to an adult. But he didn't take offense. He just said, at Summit, we aren't afraid of questions. And all of a sudden, I realized I was in an environment where I could express my doubts and learn to know the truth. And I don't know how I missed that growing up, but I always got the impression growing up that asking questions was doubting, and doubting was a sin. So asking questions was a sin, and it's amazing how virtually every person in my youth group growing up walked away from their faith because they just weren't equipped. But God somehow saw fit for me to be able to attend the Summit Ministries program, and now irony of ironies, to be the president of the ministry.
And again, let's talk about this virtual idea, because how many times over the years have we talked about going to Colorado Springs or Bryan College or wherever it might be and spending some time. But this virtual program is really exciting because it is a veritable who's who, many of whom we've interviewed on this program, that they will have a chance to learn from. So tell us more about this idea of a virtual Summit Ministries.
That's right. Well, this adds to what we do. We have our in-person programs that, God willing, will be able to open up in July and June. We've got one now at Covenant College in Georgia, and that one's opening up in June. So we're gradually getting to that. But the Summit Virtual is a 5-day live, interactive, online program for young adults whose budget is such or time is such that having 5 days is about all they can get during the summer. And this program, as you mentioned, brings together top Christian thought leaders, best-selling authors. And what's so great about it, Kerby, is that the students feel a very personal engagement with it. I'm just on my desk. I've got papers scattered. We detail, examine the effectiveness of every program, and it's powerful to see how engaged young people are online. They're sick of being at home, obviously. They're sick of e-learning, but our team has created a really powerful, fun, fast-paced program that keeps them locked in from beginning to end for those 5 days.
Let me just mention, too, for anybody that's interested right now, we have a link to that. You can, of course, go to summit.org and then scroll through to Summit Virtual, but we have the link there as well. There is a wonderful video that you've done that's about 4.5 minutes long that gives you an update, but then there's all sorts of other videos that show you, even one that's kind of about 2 minutes long that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of what session 1 looked like. But more importantly, we can start maybe working our way through Monday through Friday, because in some respects you cover all sorts of different kinds of issues that are stumbling blocks for young people, right?
That's exactly right, Kerby. We do a lot of studies of young adults, and I can say very confidently, and I know you would agree with me on this because of the nature of your work, almost no Christian young person feels confidently equipped for what they know they're going to face on the university campus, and my goodness, just face going downtown right now in any city in America.
And again, one of the challenges they're facing is, as you said, the questions that they're being asked, but also even some of them are going to find themselves really transitioning to maybe an online situation. So they might as well get used to it right now and learn from some of the individuals that I know are such dynamic speakers. So talk about what we will cover. Maybe we can just go over a little bit, but I've got in front of me here what you covered just on day 1 on Monday, and it's things like the case for life as well as bioethics, and even by the time you get some of these breakout sessions, you have the cold case reliability of the gospel, the case against relativism. These are the kind of issues that young people are going to be encountering when they show up on a college campus, right?
That's right, yes. So we build our foundation from the beginning that you are an image bearer of God. Your life is valuable. Every human life is valuable. And then we begin what we call tactics. We begin to teach the students how to ask questions and engage with people who believe differently. And so by the end of day 1 of the 5 days, they have a sense that, oh, wait a second, I know how to do this. I don't have to hide my head and escape from the world around me. I can engage it, and now I know what to say. I know what to do. When we teach about pro-life, for example, we give the students a really simple acrostic that they can learn, and so that they can defend the pro-life view that we teach them in within 30 minutes, and they can get it and then articulate it to other people. So it's pretty fun. There's obviously we have great fun hosts. This is a program taught by boomers and Gen Xers, run by millennials for Gen Z. So every generation is involved in this, and it is really, really fun to watch. But even our breakout sessions are by people like J. Warner Wallace, who wrote that best-selling book, Cold Case Christianity, about defending the reliability of the New Testament.
Let's take a break. When we'll come back, we'll talk a little bit longer with Dr. Jeff Myers. And if you want to go to the website right now, you can begin to see who the speakers are. You can get a little bit of a sense of the schedule. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those. And then we'll also just get into some very practical things. How do you register? What do you need to know? What kinds of materials do you need to have ahead of time? All sorts of questions that I know you have. So we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the unnecessary tragedies of this pandemic has been the deaths of so many elderly patients in nursing homes, especially in New York. One Democratic assemblyman who represents Queens criticized the state because it failed to protect the lives of the most vulnerable members of our community. He went on to say the fact that we maintained and pushed COVID-positive patients into facilities that were not equipped to handle them, it was a fatal error. You know, as sad as that decision was, what is even more concerning is how and why that decision was made. There was a directive that was issued that a state official says, quote, was meant to protect those infected with the coronavirus from discrimination. Now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, in a recent article, explains what that official-sounding phrase about discrimination really meant. You know, it appears that New York wanted to create a new protected class. That would be a patient with COVID-19. Now, the guidance issued by the state seems to prohibit even testing a patient to see if he or she was still contagious. It proclaimed, quote, no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to the nursing home solely based on a confirmed or suspected diagnosis of COVID-19, unquote. So New York had more than 5,600 nursing home deaths. The governor and many other health officials admit that their policy was a deadly decision. But only recently have some begun to understand that this fatal decision was not based on the science. Apparently, it was based on a misguided attempt to implement a social justice ideal of non-discrimination against patients infected with the coronavirus, who then spread it to thousands of other patients. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jeff Myers with us for a little bit longer, and let me just mention that the last time we had him on, we talked about his book, Unquestioned Answers. That is a book that I would highly recommend, and if you go to summit.org and go to the book section, you can find out some more. But before we talk about some of the other things in the program, I suspect by now, Jeff, some people are saying, okay, you convinced me, I want to go, or my parents want me to go, or the parents or grandparents are saying, I think Bob or Sue need to go. So they've already said, okay, what do we do? How do we register for Summit Virtual?
You go to summit.org, Kerby, and at summit.org you'll find the link where you can register. You can pick any one of the 3 remaining sessions that we have, and then you put down the money there. It's about $500 for the session. And by the way, that includes free college credit. So about half the students are taking 3 college credits, which is almost a $2,000 value that's free, included with the program. And then we'll send you all the materials. We'll send a little gift box to the young man or young woman, has some goodies in it, and so all the materials that they will need, they'll get that in the mail. and then they can join in for a couple of hours in the morning online and a couple of hours in the evening each day, plenty of breaks, but a very engaging program. And you know, we did just talk about how we cover pro-life, we cover tactics. You know, by the time we get to day 2, we're talking about if God is good, why is there evil in the world?
Evil, yeah.
Responding to that. You know, the Christian worldview, does Jesus really heal everything? A closer look at Islam, marriage, why it matters. Then we talk about different worldviews that are going to challenge students on the campus, the secular worldview and the Marxist worldview. How do you respond biblically and intelligently to those? And then new spirituality, postmodernism, and we talk about same-sex attraction. So really, there's no issue that's huge in society that we don't go through. And then we also have lots and lots of visits from celebrity individuals who just love Summit and love kids, like Kirk Cameron, Andy Mineo, so many others. Kevin Sorbo, who is the evil Professor Radisson in God's Not Dead, is actually a strong believer. He comes and talks to the students virtually. So they have a lot of fun. They get to meet a lot of great celebrities. Your senator there, Ted Cruz, came and offered a testimonial, and it was all about why you should read the Bible every day. It was just beautiful. So it's really fun to have all generations coming together around young adults who are bored right now. They're worried. They're scared of what they see happening in their society, and what they're really longing for is to build a community around people who love Jesus and have good answers to their hard questions.
And again, as you pointed out just a minute ago, they can receive 1, 2, or 3 college credits if they want to do some extra work. But let's talk about the fact that this isn't just sitting there passively and watching, because you have peer engagement, you have small group discussion, they have a staff mentor. Some listeners might say, well, just what I need, my kids or my grandkids to spend more times looking at a screen. Well, it's a little more interactive than that, isn't it?
This isn't the typical looking at a screen. It is absolutely not what most kids are used to, the e-learning that's really, just room to Zoom and just watching passive lectures. There's nothing passive about this. The entire thing is engaging. They're asking questions as they go. The speakers are answering their questions as they go along. They have discussion groups, small groups. I was just looking through all of the student results, and they're saying, I've never been in a community quite like this before. The community that developed around it, I made friends, all of these kinds of things, and you're thinking, are you kidding me? In my generation, the idea that you could do that online seems impossible, but for their generation, they don't see it that way. What they're longing for is to find people who are, all over the world who love Jesus and are willing to really dig in and grapple with very difficult things. The other thing that you did kind of mention this, we have a mentor chat because we run it 24 hours a day, Kerby, because sometimes I was just hearing a story this morning, one student, 2 o'clock in the morning, they just couldn't rest because they had some really big issue to deal with. And 24 hours a day, we talk to them to help them through what personal issues, worldview issues, questions about their faith, all of those kinds of things during the program, because we want them to feel loved and connected and to have answers.
And again, one of the things that you're really focusing on are some of those critical needs. Some of those are the perennial issues, like you talked about just a minute ago, whether it's the reliability of the Bible or whether it's how could a good God allow evil in the world, or some of them are things like maybe the more contemporary issues like identity and relationships, the redefinition of marriage, pornography, and a variety of others. So there's kind of a mix and match. And in some respects, I've said this before, the kinds of challenges that some of us that are a little bit older around the table had to face were significant enough. But now in this digital world and in this world of post-truth and post-modernism, these young people are facing even more. And as one of our particular guest the other day said, we don't want to send them up to the mulcher or the meat grinder up there in the university without being better prepared, because if they don't know what they believe, they're just going to get ground up, aren't they?
They are, and at Summit, we're asking 3 questions, and I would ask any parent, if you've got a young adult 16 to 25 right now, 3 things that I want you to think about. Number 1, do they want to engage the culture, and do they feel prepared to do it? Number 2, are they boldly grappling with the barriers that would stop them personally from living a life that's fully committed to Jesus? And then number 3, are they eager to grow deeper in their faith? those are the sorts of, that's what we look for when students come to one of our programs in person or the Summit virtual. That's what we're looking to have happen, is that we want to create in them a sense of hunger and thirst for Jesus and for the Bible and for finding answers to the kinds of questions that keep their friends away from embracing Christ as their Savior.
Let's talk about the urgency, because if they want to register for session 2, I'm looking at your clock here, they've got 2 days, and that one then would be June 8th through the 12th. Then you have another one later in June, the 22nd to the 26th, and you have one in July 6th through 10. So one is already gone, 3 are left, but if they sit around too long, they're going to miss this opportunity, aren't they?
You will miss the opportunity, yes. So the sign-up deadline for the event that begins 1 week from today is actually 2 days from now on Wednesday. So you want to go to summit.org and reserve that seat. There are, because it's so personal and we have small groups and discussion groups and so forth, we do have to limit the number of seats. So it's not like, online you might as well be able to have thousands. We don't. So we do limit the number of seats, and we want every Christian young person to have that opportunity to be part of something like this summer. We don't want them to be bored. We want them to get ready for battle, get armed.
And again, one of the things that you have available at Summit are also the Summit Worldview Library. You have some of the Summit DVD series, some of the best, and so those are some additional resources you might consider purchasing for this young person. Maybe they're not ready to go to college yet, but you can begin to encourage them by getting them some of those books, because then as they read those books, they watch those DVDs, then when they later on do go to Summit Ministries or Summit Virtual, they'll be prepared for that as well. And it's never too young to start preparing them for what they're going to encounter when they go into a culture that, Jeff, is really very hostile to the Christian faith sometimes.
You're watching the news today. You're seeing how hostile this culture is. You're seeing what happens when people forget God, authority breaks down, and a nation falls into chaos. Can it happen here? It has happened here. The only question we have left is whether we want our kids as Christian young people to be equipped to be confident and to stand for truth and to fight against evil in the times in which we live.
Well, again, we've had with us today Dr. Jeff Myers, and if you would like to know a little bit more, you can click on the button that will take you to summit.org. We also, of course, have one for Summit Virtual. And if nothing else, as you just said a minute ago, anybody that doubts whether or not we need to prepare young people for the world around us just needs to turn on the television set or go out on the internet and see what is happening right now, as so much of our culture seems to be degrading into anarchy. So if nothing else, Jeff Myers, we appreciate your good work. Thank you for what you do there at Summit Ministries, and look forward to the next opportunity to have you here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Great to visit with you.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of these issues. One of the things that happened over the weekend, which I'll probably postpone till Friday, was a disturbing decision that came down from the Supreme Court, where they decided not to even consider the case out of the Ninth Circuit on the issue of religious liberty and how that related to the various churches that wanted to open up last Saturday and Sunday. And so as a result, what you had are the liberal justices, that would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, who were joined by, are you ready for this? John Roberts. And so that is of concern in that regard, and certainly it illustrates, again, one of the things we talked about last week with you had about 1,200 different pastors, about 3,000 different churches in California that wanted to open up, and the case was not even taken by the Supreme Court to decide. So we will certainly get into some of that conversation with Kelly Shackelford. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things we'll get into is the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group. The third article that we have posted here, which I'll talk about in just a minute, by Andrew McCarthy, says, I don't think we really need to do that. He disagrees with the president, and there have been some people that have thought that that may be a good idea, others that have not. So I want to get into that in just a minute. And then we'll also talk about what can we maybe do when we have bad cops. Well, with this all developed in large part because of some individuals, and I'm going to give you some of their history in just a minute. Not only the individual that has been charged, but the others that I believe should be charged with a crime that have already been, in some respects, protected and should have been brought to justice a long time ago, and then George Floyd would still be alive. So what to do about bad cops? Was that all racially motivated? Maybe, maybe not. It almost doesn't matter because death happens either way, and it is a tragedy that needs to stop, and how can we stop it? So we'll get to that in just a minute. But I thought I might share something that I haven't seen anybody else say, but you know, maybe that means I'm wrong, but this has really been kind of a bad couple of days for your progressive pundits for a couple of very good reasons. Because there is kind of this worldview, this mindset, this meme, whatever you want to call it, that hasn't quite worked out so well. One of those is that, of course, the death of George Floyd took place in Minneapolis. This is not the first time we've had an example of police brutality that led to the death of an African-American citizen in that city. Philando Castile, I mentioned and before. And as a matter of fact, I saw this the other day where it said the last time Minneapolis was burned like this was in July of 1967. 53 years later, the death of George Floyd led to, of course, this riotous aftermath that is only sort of been quelled but never extinguished. And the point I'm making is that for a lot of these progressive or liberal pundits, it has not worked out so well because they want to try to make it look like racism is something that you find in the Deep South. Racism is something that you find among white supremacists. Those individuals that engage in this are maybe Trump supporters. They're certainly Republicans. They may be rednecks. And that hasn't worked out so well because here you have at least two very prominent national deaths that have taken place in Minneapolis. Not that Minneapolis is, say, San Francisco or Seattle or Boulder, Colorado, but it has always been identified, as this particular article points out. Minneapolis has had a progressive image, but it hasn't been necessarily always borne out by some of the actions that have taken place there. And you think of some of the other names that I've mentioned. Eric Gardner, well, that death took place in New York City. Freddie Gray, that took place in Baltimore. In many cases, places where you've had African-American mayors, where you've had African-American police chiefs. So it hasn't really helped sometimes in terms of creating kind of that image. A second, which is kind of interesting, really comes from Van Jones. The other days, Van Jones said something I thought was sort of like crazy talk, and yet I've learned over the years that even when you say, I'm not sure I believe or even understand why he said it, he was saying that what we have is that in every white person, we have a virus in their heads. I thought, what? First of all, every white person, that kind of sounds like a racially stereotyped kind of idea. But then I got to understand what he was saying, and that is he was trying to explain how even people that you would think would never say something or do something that you would see perpetuates a racial stereotype or was racist actually took place. And what he was talking about is something we talked about last week, and that is Amy Cooper. Remember when she was walking her dog in Central Park, and then she came upon a bird watcher who was African American. And then we've all seen the video of where she's just terrified. First of all, she's not even controlling her dog, and looks like she's maybe not even holding her dog correctly. And the bird watcher, whose last name was also Cooper as well, no relation, is showing, and she's on the phone, and she's scared. There's this African-American man. He's threatening me, and on and on and on. And what Van Jones was trying to say is that here's an individual that I would never have expected would go into this. She, as far as we know, was a liberal. He said she's a Hillary Clinton supporter. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he said. And yet, look how all of a sudden there's like a switch goes off in her brain. And even people that we would never have expected to come up with some kind of racially tinged ideas or comments. And of course, I've already tried to defend her a little bit because there was some miscommunication. Even he wanted to offer a treat to the dog, but maybe seemed like he was going to poison the dog. There's all sorts of things going on. But nevertheless, what Van Jones was trying to explain is even people you wouldn't expect to say something that would be racist, we find they said that. And I thought, if nothing else, doesn't that underscore kind of our biblical idea that all of us, at one way or another, have some racial stereotypes running around in our brains? As a matter of fact, I've just written a booklet that'll come out in the future and documented some of the racial stereotypes that so many people sort of buy into and those kinds of things. And I thought, well, you know, the progressives always say, well, that's those people over there, not the kind of people that vote the way I do. And that didn't work out so well as that. And then the last one is for those of you in the state of Georgia, or especially those of you listening in Atlanta, know what happened at the CNN headquarters, because some people have, I think, kind of interestingly said, here are some of the pundits maybe even stoke some of the racial fires, and then they find that CNN headquarters gets attacked. And so there just been a lot of things that maybe, if nothing else, have caused, I hope, some individuals that have been these progressive pundits to maybe be a little more humble. I think all of us should be a little bit more humble, a little more introspective in light of some of the things that we've seen actually take place before our very eyes. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to the state of Texas and KYCC. Nancy, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, hi. Listen, I just turned you on, and I'm on my way, and you made a point that I needed to make sure that people know you are right, because my mother was from St. Paul, Minnesota, and she was an airline stewardess and married my dad here in El Paso. But when I was taking the train all the way up to Minnesota one particular year, she got mad at my brother because he was like 5 with a little friend who was with him, and the little boy was black, and we were both white, and she bawled my brother out in the club car, and Nancy, take your brother back, and he doesn't need to play with the other little boy. And I looked at my mother, and I thought, what?
Yeah, where did that come
I can
from?
also remember her comments in Minnesota, maybe, you know, in the summer, comment about how the blacks were moving closer and closer to a main street, not like we think of a main street, but like between a smaller amusement and zoo, Como Zoo, all the way down to the state fairgrounds. And my grandparents lived on a little side street where you could see straight across. It was more neighborhood, my mother was saying they were worried that the blacks were moving closer and closer. And I'm still looking at my mother going, I don't understand. But then I'm from El Paso, and we don't have a large black community except those that are coming in with the Army. We have a large Army base here, Fort Bliss. So I think that is what caused me to become involved with the Buffalo Soldier Memorial that we had put up at Fort Bliss.
Good for you.
Because that was the way I could stand up and say, I want to make a difference, and also because I'm a history teacher. But still, and they changed that side road when you go from the airport to that, or by that memorial with the statue of a Buffalo soldier. They changed it from Robert E. Lee Road to Buffalo Soldier Road because that's where the 9th and 10th Black Cav soldiers were housed.
Well, I really appreciate you calling. I'm coming to a natural break, but perfect illustration of some of the things we were talking about. So, Nancy, thank you for listening in. I hope you'll listen in the future, and we will take a break, and we'll come back. I want to pick up real quickly just before we run out of time today, and we'll get into a lot more of this in the next couple of days. What about this idea of designating Antifa as a terrorist organization? That is, of course, what the president wants to do. Andrew McCarthy disagrees, so I want to give you both sides to that argument, as well as just the evidence of the press trying to say, oh, this isn't Antifa. Newt Gingrich asking, who's funding all this? There's a lot more to talk about. We'll try to cover some of that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that one of the criticisms I get from time to time, and I think it's valid, is you didn't cover such and such, whatever that might be. And I'll just give you an understanding that I've got pieces of paper here we haven't even gotten to, in part because we had two different guests on for half an hour, and also because, we don't have to cover everything in one day. We have an entire week to do so. Tomorrow we got George Barna with us, and we'll spend some time talking with him, but then also getting back into the news cycle. So we have a lot more to cover, but one of the things I did want to address real quickly is the issue of Antifa for two reasons. Number one, President Trump has decided that he will identify Antifa as a terrorist organization, and there have been others in the past that have called for using this designation appropriately. In some respects, it makes some sense because the Attorney General William Barr said the other day, in many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchist and far-left extremists using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from out of state to promote the violence. And if you haven't seen some of the pictures on Facebook or Twitter of piles of bricks actually set aside and things like that, there have been some pieces of paper that have been dropped that give some instructions to individuals. There's a lot of that to suggest that this was not just all spontaneous. Some of that was orchestrated. Yes, I think the protests were spontaneous, but I think there was an attempt by various groups to use this in terms of their own agenda, and so that is the case. And so it is worth considering, but one of the things, and this is our third article that you can read if you would like, by Andrew McCarthy, is there's no need for new laws. Calls to enact them are, he says, either ill-conceived or usually the case of preening politicians sensing the need to look like they're doing something. And you might say, again, who's Andrew McCarthy? He points out that I was the one, he says, that led the prosecution of the jihadists who bombed the World Trade Center back in the 1990s and planned a more ambitious campaign because they wanted to bomb New York City landmarks like the Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, the United Nations complex, the FBI's Manhattan office, military installations, and the rest. So he stopped that, and I appreciate his work in that regard. But he said also when the Attorney General, Bill Barr, mentioned the violent agenda of the rioters, he said it pinged my agenda. But he says, of course, for society to flourish, the rule of law must assert itself. Justice must be done, which means bringing anti-American domestic terrorists to heel. Rioters can and will do immense damage if, as some foolishly suggest, we wait for them to exhaust themselves. That was one of the statements that was made this weekend, too. Just hard to believe. And so to put some perspective on that, Dan Bongino the other day pointed out that, again, how you have people covering. One PBS reporter claimed that, for example, that President Trump's assertion that Antifa was involved, that there was no evidence of that, while at the same time posting a picture of someone spraying an anarchist A on a building. Okay, it is theoretically possible that somebody wearing a black outfit, black mask, putting an Antifa symbol on a building is not with Antifa. But it's not real likely either. Dan Bongino went on to say, if a group of conservatives appeared regularly in liberal cities wearing black masks, were carrying weapons and incendiaries, breaking windows, setting fires, attacking innocents and looting, there'd be an outcry in the media. And he says, well, you don't even have to think about that hypothetically. Look at the response when you had what was essentially a fairly peaceful demonstration in the capital of Michigan. But he says, let Antifa show up along with other groups, and all of a sudden there isn't that much of concern. And he points out that some of the people making excuses for some of that are simply, as he said, pandering to people who they believe are vital to defeating Donald Trump in November. And, of course, there's been a real question about where is the funding for this coming from. Newt Gingrich has pointed out that some of these same individuals, some of these same groups are the ones that trashed Seattle a number of years ago. And that was during, of course, the WTO and some of that. And he said, again, they've made a habit of this. He says, who's paying these people? He said, I was appalled that 13 of Joe Biden's staff were donating money to bail people out of the jails in Minneapolis. By the way, not only those, but a number of various celebrities in Hollywood are doing the same thing. And if nothing else, if they want to spend their money, my recommendation is why don't they help the individual, the African American that built that sports bar and then saw it burn to the ground. Okay, so what do we do about all this? Well, we're now starting to find out a lot more about the individual that brought about the death of George Floyd, Derek Chauvin. He had 18 different complaints. Only 2 of those even resulted in a letter of reprimand. The former officer as well who was watching this, the Asian, Tao Thao, actually had 6 complaints against him that were filed with Internal Affairs, one which is still open. And we've seen some of these articles about, when in particular cases, the African American saying probably he was more roughly treated by him than anyone else. And so he was also, by the way, this Asian involved in a lawsuit that the city of Minneapolis settled for $25,000. So we're starting to recognize these are individuals that had some complaints. So it brings us to a piece by John Fund in which he says it's past time to examine how police unions protect bad cops. He points out that we've had police brutality for some time, going all the way back to the Jim Crow police departments. But he says it's really time to maybe start looking at how police unions, he says, play in perpetuating police brutality. Mayor de Blasio, for example, in New York, has frequently tangled with the unions, but he's never challenged their political power. And yet you have individuals, here's one from a retired New York Police Department commander, who said the unions, at least in New York City, outright just protect the cops. It's a blanket system of covering up police officers. One scholar writing in the Stanford Law Review said that ever since the rise of police unions to political power in the 1970s, they've succeeded in shielding their members from public accountability. And the executive director of the Minnesota Chief of Police told even Fox News, Chris Wallace, he says, I believe that cell phone videos are game changers. They weed out the bad apples. Video is definitely the key in this case, as it is in so many other cases. Yes, but why can't the police unions weed out the bad cops rather than have so many people die and videos being necessary to weed out the bad cops? And so I think John Fund, who's been on this program with us before, is on to something. And just as we've sometimes have seen teachers' unions that have unfortunately protected some really bad teachers, and maybe just simply set them aside. And it's bad enough that we've harmed the education of young people. Even worse is if we have, in some cases, police unions that have been protecting bad cops. Let's see if we can turn that around as well. There are a lot of solutions that I want to look at over the next couple of days. That's just one I wanted to put on the table for you to think about. And when we come back tomorrow, we'll get back into some more of these issues. But if you'd like to see a little bit more, we have some great articles that we've posted today on the website, pointofview.net. My commentary today is about these nursing homes and how this idea, this wrong-headed idea of social justice may have led to such a loss of life. And, of course, we'll come back to the pandemic as well, because there's certainly a lot to cover there as well. All of that is available on the website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll take the time to read it and maybe print some of it out, pass it on, maybe post it on a Facebook page or a Twitter post, and get some conversation going. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes, for Steve as well. We will cover all sorts of issues tomorrow right here on Point of View.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website, or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.